Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Everybody get out your phones. We're going to start with a polling question. So get them out, get them ready. What I want to talk to you about today, being a futurist, is the awesome future of retail. So my question to you is, we're going to go back to the polling question, which is, the future of retail will be awesome, true or false? Yes, I talk like a 13-year-old, I know. True or false? It will be awesome, true or false? Text in. Here we go. True. 100% true. Well, everybody have a good conference. My work is done here. Thank you so much. Oh, wait. Oh, there we go. Whoever said false, thank you, because you actually now give me something to do. Okay, great. We'll move on. So, as Ryan said, I'm Brian David Johnson. I'm Intel's futurist. And what I wanted to do this morning is talk to you a little bit about sort of what I do as a futurist, what my job is, but then also talk to you about some of the things that I'm seeing in technology and how they're driving the future of retail. It is a pleasure to be here because I've spent really the last 10 years of my career actually looking at retail and looking at shopping, so much so that I've actually even working on a science fiction novel about the future of shopping in a mall. So I've sort of been doing a lot of work in that. And that's what we'll talk about, and then I'll take some questions at the end. So if you look at my first slide really closely, it says I work for a large company and we have a lot of lawyers. Oh, do we have any lawyers in the house? All right, so I did that, right? You saw that, I did that. Okay, now we can move on. So who am I? As Ryan said, I'm Brian David Johnson. I'm Intel's futurist. It's my job to look 10 to 15 years out into the future and model how people will act and interact with technology. Now, I do that because at Intel, to make the chips, it takes about 5 to 10 years to design, develop, and deploy the chips. So it's of vital business importance today for Intel to want to know what's going to happen 10 years from now. I'm a principal engineer at the company. It's my job to write a spec. And that spec basically says, this is what it'll feel like to be a human and live in the future. And then from there, we get all the techie stuff that you would expect about the hardware requirements and the software requirements. And so much of what I do is actually experience modeling. That's actually what it's called, is experience modeling. What will the effect of all of this be? And for me, one of the early models that I built in this was retail, was shopping, because it is such a rich experience. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But if you really want to know who I am, you can pretty much tell everything you need to know about me by looking at this picture. This is me with hair at the age of 13. As I say, you can pretty much tell everything you need to know about me by one object in this picture. I'll give you some help. It's that. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a calculator watch. Make no bones about it, I am a nerd. I have always been a nerd, I will always be a nerd. I am a geek. I love everything science, I love everything science fiction, and these things come together in the work that I do. Now let's talk a little bit about that work. Let's talk a little bit about thinking about the future. Now, usually when people come to us and talk about the future, I tell them, we have to have a vision for the future. That's where it all starts. So what is that vision? Where do you want to go? And typically, when people talk to us about the future, this is usually what they show us, right? Usually it could be in advertising, it could be in movies, it's this, right? It's usually the really good-looking guy or the really good-looking girl. It's got a really cool, streamlined piece of technology, and they're usually in a really super cool, super modern apartment. I can tell you, I hate this picture. I hate this picture because if we're going about doing the real work, the real business of building the future, when I look at this, I ask myself, where are the baby toys? I ask myself, where are the family photos? Where are the pillows? Right? Where's the stuff that makes us comfortable? That's the wonderful thing about being human beings, is that we're complicated. We have different beliefs, we have different tastes, we have different religions. We're incredibly complicated, and this is a really good thing. It's actually what makes us great. And when I look at this, if we're actually thinking about building the future, I think at best, this is intellectually dishonest. And at worst, I think it's an insult to the complexity of human beings. Now, I can also say that I hate this picture because this picture comes from Intel, which doesn't make me a lot of friends in the marketing department. Now, on my next slide, I actually have a picture of what the future is actually going to look like. Who would like to see it? There we go. I bet you it was probably the students who whooped in the back. Let's be clear. You're so polite. So I have to tell you, I spent a lot of time actually talking in front of colleges, and I was presenting once to a room of about 600 undergraduate engineering students, which is also known as the toughest audience on earth. And so I'm there, I'm Intel's Futurist, I'm talking about the future, and I have this up, and I'm going to show them the future. And I'm like, who wants to see the future? And it's completely silent, except for one kid way in the back who goes, sure. I come all the way out, all I get is, sure. Okay, get ready, hold on to something. You're going to mark your time, right? There was the time before you knew what the future was going to look like and the time after. This is your transition moment. Get ready. Bam. Now, I have to tell you, for what I did, this comes from a piece of social science research that we've done in my lab. The reason why I like this, by the way, it's full of technology. It's actually this, from a pound for pound, technology-wise, this has more technology and more future stuff in it. But the reason why I like this, right, is it's messy. Right? She's got stuff on her chest of drawers, the drawers open at the bottom, she's even in her bare feet. So when I'm starting to think about the future, this is the way that I think about it. I want to design and build a future that is designed for real human beings, that's designed for the complexity and the richness of humans and our customers and the people we interact with. I also would like to live in this future, because this future looks really great and comfortable. I don't want to live in this future because this future looks like prison. I want to live in this future. She has a pillow. You might be able to see it. Literally, the pillow says, chill out. I also have another question. Do we have any science fiction fans? Anybody? Oh, we have a few. Okay. I have a question. Why in the future is everybody bald? Have you noticed this? There's like a whole bunch of like science fiction dystopian things that everybody's bald in the future. Good for me, but for Terry, not so much. Okay. So how do we do it? As you can imagine, I work at an engineering company, so there's a process. There's a way of thinking about the future. And it really starts with the fact that I don't make predictions. If you remember anything about my talk today, please remember I refuse to make predictions. Typically, if somebody's going to give you a prediction, they're trying to sell you something. For me, I don't want to be the person who was right. That's what we talk about in my lab. We don't want to be the people who are like, I said this thing and this thing happened, right? If you go to most of the media and things like that, it's full of people who are saying how right they were. And I say that's useless to us. It's really our job to build a meaningful future for people. And so we want to be the people who get it right. We want to be able to pull together all this information and actually create engaging experiences for people. And the process we use to do that is something called future casting. It's all based on social science. It's all based on having an understanding of people. And coming from retail, that's the basis of what you do. Understanding your customers is so incredibly important. And so we have social scientists who go all over the world studying humans. They don't study markets. They don't study demographics. They study real people, how they live, how they work, how they shop, how they fall in love. We sort of study that, and everything gets built from that. Because ultimately, I think it should be our goal to figure out how we can use all of our technology, how we can use all of the business that we do to make the lives of those people better. And if we do that, then we're going to do good business. And so we have this process to base on that, kind of look 10 to 15 years out and say, this is kind of where we see things going, and we say, this is the future we want, and this is the future we want to avoid. And then we talk about what are the actionable steps we can take today to get to that future we want and to avoid that future that we don't want. And that's really the future casting process. And I want to tell you one of the things that has really driven my work for the past 4 years, as I look kind of 10 years out, is this fact. And I think as we start looking to the future of retail, to me, this is one of the driving forces that will literally change everything about retail. I actually think it will change everything about our daily lives as well. But very specifically, we're going to talk about how this will change retail. What this says is that as we approach the year 2020, the size of meaningful computational power, the size of the chip that goes into all of these devices, begins to approach 0. So right now, we're at about 14 nanometers, and I talked to my colleagues at Intel, and we're going to be at around 5 nanometers in 2020. 5 nanometers is about 12 atoms across. So this changes everything. It changes the question we have to ask ourselves, not only when it comes to technology, but when it comes to the businesses and the experiences we're going to build. And what I mean by that is, for decades, we had to ask ourselves, can we do something? Can we take a desktop and make it small enough to fit on somebody's lap? Can we take a laptop and make it small enough to fit into somebody's pocket or their pocketbook with a tablet or a smartphone? It was, can we do it? But when you have the size of meaningful computational power approaching 0, you can turn anything into a computer. You can turn this table into a computer. We can turn my jacket into a computer. We can even turn my body into a computer. So it's not can we do it. The question we have to ask ourselves is completely different. It's what? What do we want to do? And why? Why are we doing it? And I think it is an incredibly empowering question because we're no longer held back by our technology. We can actually start thinking in a very different way about the experiences that we're building and the experiences that we're bringing to our customers and to other people. Now, I also have to tell you, I love this graphic. This is a relatively new graphic for me. I don't know if you can see way in the back, but there's a woman in the 1960s. She's got a bouffant hairdo. And I don't know if you can also see the guy in the 1970s who's got bell-bottoms on. Now, here's a question. Can anybody figure out who it is in the year 2010? Anybody? Take a guess? Steve Jobs. Thus proving whoever said that is smarter than I am. Because I had this and was showing it to people like all over the world for like the longest time. And somebody said, oh, that's Steve Jobs. And I was like, oh my goodness, that's Steve Jobs. So I called the graphics team who made this for me, who they're really good and very funny. And I said, did you know that that's Steve Jobs? And they started laughing. They were like, I know, it took you like a month to figure it out. And then they did the thing that they love to do. They went futurist, and they hung up. All right, so let's talk about what all this actually means for the future of retail. So as I said, I've been doing work in the future of retail for over a decade now, and it kind of ebbs and flows. And I do think that we're in a time where we're having increased interest around the future of retail, and I think that's a kind of an academic discussion about why that's happening, and I kind of, for myself, see it as we're kind of coming out of the recession and into the recovery, that we're having this kind of surge in rethinking the retail space. One of the more recent pieces that we did last year was this piece where we partnered with WPP, the big design company, a research company, and started thinking about what the future of retail might look like. And if you think back to the sort of my grounding about what the future will look like 10 to 15 years from now, I truly believe that in most of the work that we do, the future will pretty much look like today. That's really sort of how these things work. I was just talking to Ryan, my colleague, this morning, who's looking at buying a house that's from when? 1854. We actually don't want our future to look like this radically changed Jetson world. Ryan is buying a house from like centuries ago. We actually like things that not change very much. And so what we do change, though, is we change the devices, we change the technology, we make little changes, and then also we make massive changes, as we know, on a business standpoint in the back end. So we looked at this idea and we said, well, let's think about the objects. Let's think about the stuff that's going to be in the retail environment. And so we broke it down in 3 different ways. And we had this idea of saying, well, again, what I model is the experience of retail. We'll say, well, for people, for the actual consumer, what will the face of retail be like? Literally, when you walk into the stores, what objects could change the face of retail? And the one that I brought up, because as a futurist, I get questions all the time. Like literally what everybody asks me is, when will the holograms happen? This is the question I get all the time. That, and then when will the robots rise up and take over? Those are usually the 2 questions that I get. And we can answer that one if you want a little bit later. But people ask, so when will we have holograms? And if you had asked me back in 1992, I would say 10 years from now. Because that's always the answer, 10 years from now. And then if you'd asked me in 2002, I would have told you 10 years from now. Because it's always just over the horizon. It's always just 10 years from now. And then I got a call from a colleague of mine a few years ago, and he called me and he goes, "It's 9 years away." I was like, ooh. Because actually from a technology standpoint, we're almost there, right? We have the capture technology with 3D cameras. We certainly have the computation and the compression to be able to crunch it down, and we can get all nerdy. There's CPUs and GPUs being able to crunch all that stuff down. But the big thing that actually changed about a year ago is we actually have the plate. So MIT just came out with a plate that actually can do a color hologram. They did a butterfly. It's actually quite beautiful, but it's a butterfly. And so for me, now I start extrapolating out, because again, I kind of live my life on the other side of the exponential curve, right, 10 to 15 years out in the future. My wife likes to say that I live my life 10 to 15 years in the future and commute home on the weekends. And so if you go out now 10 years, you can begin to see that things like holograms, how they will change the nature of retail, the face of it. That what will it afford us to do from an idea of how people will act and interact with objects, if the object can actually be there in a volumetric way, but you don't actually have to have it on the back shelf. It doesn't have to be in the back room. So that, what is that in-store experience like? And then as you go a little bit forward, I think it becomes really interesting and actually somewhat radical when you start having those holograms at home. That how will people interact with products, how will people interact with services when it is actually in your living room and you can play around with it. And I think it's an incredible opportunity because you're pulling down the walls, you're pulling down the layers between the customer and humans and products and experiences. You actually can literally bring it into the living room, which I think has an incredible disruptive effect on the experience of retail. The second that, one of the things that I find interesting, and this is one way of talking about wearables, and I like to just talk about kind of intelligent fashion, that having your clothes be smart. And I like to have a little bit of fun with this, because you can think about, well, what will it mean when you can walk into a store and you can turn anything into a computer, so you're surrounded by computational intelligence. I think that's one of the things that's really interesting about this notion of compute moving to zero, is you can have more computation in our environment than we have in our pockets or our pocketbooks or these devices. So when you're surrounded by this intelligence, what would it mean then to have people's clothes act and interact with the retail space? And then when people take these home, how does that then extend the brand reach? How does that extend where people go? And I was working with a group of students in an MFA program recently, and then they started taking it even further, which is, to me, what makes me so excited about having so many students involved in this, is we had a young student, and she was thinking about a men's clothing line, and the shirts tweet to their owners. The shirt that hasn't been worn in 2 weeks starts to send angry tweets to you, which is genius. And then, of course, because I like conflict, I'm like, well, what if like shirt A and shirt B start trash talking each other? Because they're competing for you to want to wear them. And then the pants get into it and go, whoa, 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 slow down there. Because the pants, you can wear jeans with anything, right? So they're like, whoa. And then it became this really interesting, in like the matter of 5 minutes, this really interesting ecosystem of conversations where your clothes get smart and are sort of talking to you. And then imagine you kind of go into a store and this shirt starts talking to another shirt. And for me, now if this is actually going to happen, which I hope it does, that'd be really cool, but it shows that you can start taking some of these relationships and these experiences and grafting them on in really kind of fun and interesting ways that you would normally, I mean, it's for myself coming as a futurist and talking about sort of wearables, this is a way that wearables actually become fun. This is actually how what it might feel like to have wearables, but have them do silly stuff. Have them do, crazy stuff, but that deepens your relationship and deepens that experience with all of the products that we have. The next area on the face of retail, which is the one that when we first announced this, I have to tell you, everybody thought I was insane. Right? I said, we're going to make the shelf smart. And everybody wanted like jetpacks and rocket cars, and they wanted all this sort of stuff. And I said, no, we're just going to look at the humble shelf. Like the most unsexy thing out there, the humble shelf. So what if we make the shelf smart? And I said, think about that. the shelf, I mean, the shelf's been around for a long time, right? You go back to Roman markets, the shelf has been there working for us time and time again, and we refuse to make it smart. I was like, well, what would that be like if you could have an intelligent shelf? Because it is, for me, what I found interesting when it comes to the face of retail, the experience of retail, the shelf literally is the platform. Literally, it is a platform for you to act and interact with products. It is literally a way that people interact with goods and sometimes even with services that people can interact with it. What would it mean to make the shelf smart? What would you do with that? And in one of the design experiments that we did, and again, I get very pragmatic. So I believe that the work that we should do should always make the lives of people better. It should entertain them more, or make them more efficient, or make them more productive, or make them healthier. And instantly, my mind went to, imagine if you had an intelligent shelf, right? And you walked into a store, and say it's a grocery store, and one of your loved ones, say your daughter, has a peanut allergy, right? Very common, and as we know, peanut allergies can be lethal, literally. I mean, it can affect the lives of people. So imagine that you walk into a store, and because of your smartphone or your intelligent fashion, the store and the shelves begin to know that your daughter has this terrible allergy. So every single product that has peanuts in it, or every single product that is made in a factory that processes peanuts, all goes black and says, don't buy this. Just like that. All of a sudden, these shelves begin caring for somebody that you care for. And imagine the effect that that then has on you as you move through this store, that your devices, your technology, the retailer, and the shelves are all working for you. Which I think is a great way of saying, okay, this is one way that we can use all of this tech and all of this technology to really care for people. Now, the next section is the bones of retail, whereas you had the face of retail before, which was looking at what it would be like for consumers to act and interact with this world. Then we said, well, the next step would be, let's look at the bones of retail. What goes on behind the scenes? You know, the work that a lot of you do. What changes there? And we released this report, like I said, last year. And before, I could talk about drones, and I would have this sort of like fun conversation about drones and delivery, and we would talk about all the ways that you could use drones to deliver stuff. And then this kid from Amazon.com starts talking about drone delivery, like totally steals all of my thunder for this. And then you've got this little tiny company you might have heard of called Google, I think that's it, where he's buying all these sort of robot companies and all these drone companies. I think we're beginning to see this play out, that you can start to see how these mobile delivery technologies actually can really begin to change things. And it's starting to prove out, and for me it's really interesting because it starts to really get at some of the infrastructure costs and some of the infrastructure questions that we have. And again, one of the ways for myself as I start to think about how this could affect people, I was doing an interview once on Fox, and they, as Fox likes to do, think I'm crazy, and they think that I'm a futurist and that I'm nutty, and they said, what do you mean drones, Brian? People use drones to kill people, so you're saying we should take these machines that kill people and put them into our retail spaces? And I was like, no, not at all. I said, well, imagine being able to use a drone. You're in a retirement home, in a retirement community. You have a drugstore, and that person that day can't get out because of any number of reasons, whether it be for transportation or not being healthy enough, and being able to deliver somebody's medication locally in a retirement community. So it's actually local, and from an airspace standpoint, it actually can work. You could actually deliver that prescription to their door. We could actually do that today. And I think you will be beginning to see these sort of little tiny changes, these little tiny ways of being able to use these technologies to actually weave their way into that consumer experience. So I'm going to guess everybody's heard about 3D printing and additive manufacturing. 3D printing as a part of the work that will happen with retail and manufacturing has a big shift. But what I would push you to do is to think out a little bit further, and especially when it comes to retailing. And the reason why I put this under the bones of retail, so the nuts and bolts of what you do, is it's not actually about being able to print out products. what happens when you can print out your store? That's kind of cool. Right? Imagine being able to, as you move into the holiday season, be able to print out bits of your store and change it. And then after that, you can start to recycle it and then get ready for Easter or get ready for spring. I've been working with a lot of architecture companies of being able to literally take 3D printing out of the box. Right? Most 3D printing now happens in this little tiny box, and everything is constrained by this little tiny box. But again, as we look 10 to 15 years out, what you begin to see is that as you take it out of that box, we can imagine the interiors of the retail spaces very, very differently. That those spaces become as customizable as your digital presence. That the physical world and the virtual world, the lines between that begin to drop down, and it will enable you to be much more creative and to be much more innovative in the types of experiences that you can bring into that physical world. And so for me, that's why I think 3D printing is something that I get extraordinarily excited about. And then the last piece in the bones of retail is something that I end up talking about that I'm thinking, because I call it sentient stores, and for the science fiction fans, I think this is why people always ask me about when the robots will rise up and take over the human race, because I start talking about stores that can think. Imagine your store having enough intelligence inside of it, right? You can start having computation put into anything, right? The store itself and the retail space can understand who's in the store. It can understand what's going on inside the store. It can certainly increase efficiencies. We were joking one morning. I was joking with over breakfast, saying that when the blue shirts on aisle number 4 start to run low, the blue shirts can tweet the associate, so the associate can go over and replace them. That the store itself becomes sort of an extension of who you are and who your business is. And it's not only who you are and who your business is and how you do your business and how you work with people, but the store itself can begin to know the people who come inside. That store can become an extension of who you are, and then it can actually even go into the internet. And what I mean by that is the final piece that we've talked about in this is this idea of the secret life of data and the brains of retail. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of big data. In the work that I do, when I talk to people about big data, I always challenge you, if somebody talks about big data, ask them what it will be like to live in a future with big data. And what they will normally tell you is that there will be a lot of data. And say, that's great, then what? And then they'll say, well, it's big. It's a big deal. It's big data. It's big. And so I keep pushing people to say, well, what does that actually mean? How are we going to use it? What do you do with all of that data? How do you use it to enrich the consumer experience? And we hit upon this idea of the secret life of data. That, and many people that I work with in retail have always said that big data is not new to retail. Actually, having lots of data is actually nothing new to the retail sector. But what we can do is, with all of this data, imagine a future 10 to 15 years from now where you have data going off and doing things. You have algorithms talking to algorithms, machines talking to machines. And humans begin to have a second self that lives online. I think we're beginning to see that now, right, because of our social networking and our purchasing habits. But also your stores and your brands start to have a second self. And literally, they can go off and do things for us. Imagine when your stores or your retail presence can go off and your data can talk to other people's data and go do stuff. And what does that look like? What would that look like for you to understand who you are as a brand and who your store is? And what would it look like to then have algorithms and all of this data going off and talking to other people where you're not doing it? It's the data itself. And I think it pushes us to then think of our business and think of that experience in a really, really different way. And here's why I think the future of retail is going to be awesome. It's because in all these things that I've shown you, and granted we sort of whisked through them very, very quickly, and it's very early in the morning, but I think we're living in a really interesting time. We're living in a time where our science and our technology have reached the point where what we build is only constrained by our imaginations. This is a really big deal. Because what this says is that our future, and imagining the future and thinking about the future, we're no longer held back by our science and our technology. We're held back by our imaginations. We're held back by our ability to imagine a far more awesome future than we have today. And that when you start thinking about your future experiences and the future of your business, that it's actually your imagination that you need to encourage more than anything else. Because if you do that, then you actually can go and build it. Right? Nothing amazing was ever built by people that was not imagined first. And that you have to imagine that future. And that once you do that, then we have the science, the technology, the business, all the things that you start talking about, starts to say, okay, well, we can build that. And that's kind of what I would push to you, is to say, how are you imagining your future? What do you want that future to be? Because the future isn't an accident. The future doesn't just happen. The future is built every day by the actions of people. The future is built every day by the actions of corporations, of universities. The future is built every day by people. And you have to start by having a vision for that future. Now, in the work that I do, I take what I do really seriously. Being a futurist at Intel, I feel like that if we get it right, if I get my job right, that I can meaningfully touch the lives of almost everybody on the planet. That's actually a stated goal of Intel, to meaningfully touch the lives of people on the planet, and then I add to make their lives better. And so because I believe the future is built every day by the actions of people, I actually went out and said, okay, how do we do this? How do we change the future? And I went around and I talked to different business leaders and people from the military and scientists and researchers and said, how do we change this future? And I've gotten into a lot of arguments to say, well, can you change the future and how do you do it and what do we need to do? And I said, well, ultimately, if the future is built every day by the actions of people, how do we do it? And we landed on this idea that the way you change the future is you change the story that people tell themselves about the future that they will live in. Really simple, but really powerful, right? If you can change the story that people tell themselves about the future that they will live in, they will make different decisions. I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen at my company. I've seen it happen at universities. I've seen it happen places all over the world, that if you can change that story, we will actually do different things. And actually, I think it goes even further than it does with your own businesses, that if you can change the story that consumers tell themselves about the future, they will do different things. That if you can capture that. And I would say that because you are here, that you care about the future of your business. And that ultimately, you will be the ones who will make that change. And certainly the students in the back are going to be the ones who are going to build the future, specifically of retail. But you have to have a vision. You have to have a vision for the future that you want and the future that you want to avoid, and then you have to go and talk to people about it. In your organizations, in your businesses, in your schools, in your communities, to say, this is the future I want and this is the future I want to avoid. What do you think? And it's through that conversation is how we change that story and how you will be able to change that future. Now, we're almost done with time, so if you have any questions, start thinking about your questions. I've got one kind of last slide that takes a little bit of a story. So when I was coming up in my career, my first job was as a speechwriter. I wrote speeches for my executives. And one of the first executives I ever wrote speeches for required me that in every presentation that I gave, that I did for him, I had to include a picture of dogs playing poker. I was very young, and I didn't question it. I said, yes, sir. And I got really good at it. If there was a screen on the wall, I'd put a picture of dogs playing poker. If there was a laptop, I'd put a picture of dogs playing poker. If there was a picture frame, I got really good. I know this picture really well, right? Everybody knows, right? It's the picture, you got the bulldog, and the bulldog's got the card in his toe. I got really good at this. And so finally, we were changing in careers. He was moving on to a different company. I was actually moving to a different department. And I finally got up the guts to ask him. I said, sir, why did we have to include a picture of dogs playing poker in every presentation we gave? And he kind of smiled at me and said, Brian, everybody loves pictures of dogs playing poker. Why wouldn't you include pictures of dogs playing poker in every single presentation? And so he's right. And I've taken on this tradition. So in every presentation I give, I don't include pictures of dogs playing poker. What I do include are pictures of animals using technology. The longer you look at this, the more freaked out you're going to get. Also, I looked at the roster of people who are here. I promise you I'm not sucking up to the PetSmart people at all. But good idea, right? All right, so we're going to do questions, but I want to go back to this polling question. So we're going to go back to this polling question, and let's see. So the reason why that the future of retail will be awesome, and please go ahead and vote, is because it's in your hands. It's about what you want to do with the future of retail. It's about the vision that you have for the future of retail. And so before you vote, if the future is built every day by the actions of people, let's go build an awesome future. Why would you build a future that sucks? Let's go build a future that's great, because it is in your hands and you will do that. And then very specifically, let's begin to have that vision, and then very specifically work with the students at the back of the room, because ultimately they are the ones who are going to do it. It's our job to enable them. They are the ones who will build that awesome future. We got a little better. I almost got it. But hopefully those folks voted before I tell them it's their responsibility to work with those incredibly capable students at the back. All right, so I want to say, I think that's good. Let's go on. I want to say thank you very much. I think we saved a little bit of time for questions. Anybody have any questions?
How important do you think change management is to the future of technology in retail?
What specifically, when you say change management, do you mean?
We have a lot of programmers, we have a lot of people who create the technology, helping the actual employee and helping the customer understand how to utilize it and make it happen.
Oh, I think it's incredibly important. I mean, the idea, so much of, I think, what I've seen with retail and with brands is this transparency, that it's a relationship. That so much of what we're building is this sort of relationship, and that relationship starts certainly with the core of your business, then starts with your employees and the associates, and then actually goes out, because those associates and then the employees are the extension of that. And for me, the technology is just a tool. Technology is just a hammer. Being a technological futurist, people would think that I'm completely enamored by technology, but really, ultimately, a hammer is only interesting when you can use it to build a house. It's the effect of that technology. And so when I talk to people about how we use these technologies, ultimately what I'm talking about is the effect. What's the experience? What is the experience that we're trying to get across? And that this technology, whether it be a new piece of hardware or software, because technology is always going to change, but ultimately the conversation I have is about that experience and what that effect is. And I think if you have that conversation, not only with employees, but also with the customers, then it starts to make sense about why we're doing all of this work.
So I do have a question, and I'm up front here, so you don't...
Hi!
Hi. So as someone who spends many days talking to the millennials in the back, one of the issues that we have had conversations about is the future of our planet, as in the environmental future of our planet, especially at the University of Arizona, given that we are the #1 university for environmental science. And I just wondered how, in your view of the future, specifically to retail, how we deal with the reality of climate change, climate adaptation, sustainable consumption, and quite frankly, for our millennials today, income inequality. Where does that, the assumption that our future consumers are going to keep buying at the rate that we have bought and or will have the ability to buy, I think is critical. And we talk about that a lot in terms of trying to think about what that future of retail looks like. So just wanted you to comment.
That's a great question. And I think it's an important one. When you hear me talk about, our goal should be to make the lives of people better. Ultimately, my grounding is having an understanding of human beings. And one of the things that, especially at Intel, that we started a few years ago is as we start to talk about who we're building for, we have different human beings who live in different areas of the world. Well, one of the new audiences that we're building for was called Earth. Like literally, we said, what does this mean for the Earth? How are we making the life of our planet better by the work that we're doing? So I think, number one, it's a choice. Like, you have to make a choice. It goes back into this sort of why the future of retail will be awesome is because it's in our hands. I think that's one of the things we have to remember, that we control it, right? We control technology, we control this. So what is the choice? What do we want to do? And then just recently, I published a book called Humanity in the Machine that looks at this very notion, like where's the intersection between our culture and technology and business and what does it mean? And one of the questions that from this research that I came up with was this notion of what are you optimizing for? It's a very engineering question, but it's saying, what are you optimizing for? Again, what are you doing and why are you doing it? And I think it's sometimes a very hard conversation to have, that you can say, well, are you optimizing for profit? Are you optimizing for social intervention? Are you optimizing for, like you said, income equality? These are decisions that we make because if you can start to talk about what you're optimizing for, then you can begin to build it. And ultimately, there is no right answer to this. That's the point, is that at the end of the book, we have this notion of what are you optimizing for. And I actually got into it and said, well, started looking at literally the nature of evil. And the nature of evil isn't this notion that there's this demonic force out there doing bad things to good people. If you look at a lot of research around war crimes and around a lot of trials, what you find is that what people will say is that the nature of evil is thoughtlessness. That it's not thinking about what you're doing, and it's not thinking about the effect of what you're doing. So that in our businesses, with our technology, if we're not thinking about that effect, if we're not having the conversation about what are we optimizing for, then we are creating, on some level, machines of evil, because we're not thinking about that effect. But the other side of it is if you are having that conversation, and it is just having that conversation, we can then actually design our technologies and our businesses to be our better angels. Right? Human beings are complicated and we're flawed. That's what makes us interesting, but we're flawed. But if we create organizations and we create technologies, we can actually design them to be our better half, our better selves, to actually make us better people. They then can become our better angels, but we have to have that conversation. We have to talk about what we're optimizing for.
So my question, first off, I want to say I'm glad that in the future everyone will be bald because I think I'm headed down that path. So I embrace that. So what's the role of the associate within the retail store in the future? Your examples that you provided didn't really actually talk about the people that work in the store.
Well, I think it depends. Again, I would flip it back to you and say, well, what do you want it to be, number one? But the other one would be, and I know that one of the presentations before was about the jeans store up in Seattle that doesn't have any people in it at all, which is fascinating to me and quite interesting. I think ultimately, the thing that we need to remember is that human beings are social. People like people. We do. We've always been social. It's one of the things, again, that makes us great, is that we're social with people. And I think every conversation that we have in business, and especially in the business of retail and in the business of retail technologies, it's still about people. I mean, ultimately, we're always talking about a person, whether it be a customer or whether it be about somebody in businesses. I mean, we also talk about businesses. Businesses are collections of people. That ultimately these conversations that we're having are about people interacting with people. Even if you have a store that has no associates in it, it's still about people. Because there are people who are making the product, there are people who are with that business, there are people who are interacting and coming in with it. Now, I think it becomes, when it comes to the associates, is where is it most needed, right? I also, being a principal engineer, am very much about efficiency and thinking about what that experience is. But I think if you figure out where the best application of people are, that sometimes maybe you need an associate, sometimes you don't need an associate. But I think if you embrace that all of these conversations are about people, you can begin to say, oh, okay, it makes sense here or it doesn't make sense there. But usually when people ask me that question, I always try to push them back and say, don't take too many people out. I mean, I am in that way a bit of a humanist, where I'm like, don't forget the humans, because that's kind of why we're all here. So I do think it's important, but I think that you can chart where it's applicable in a very different way, because the technology is going to afford us to do a lot more. Oh, I'm getting the hook.